Hello, and welcome to another episode of the William Branham Historical Research Podcast. I'm your host, John Collins, the author and founder of William Branham Historical Research at william-branham.org. And with me today, I have my very special guest, Dr. Kerry Edwards, Doctor of Religious and Theological Studies. Kerry, it's good to have you on here. We've chatted a few times by email about the history of Latter Rain and the Pentecostal movement, apostolic faith, etc. And you have some deep connections to all of this, and you're a doctor of religious and theological studies. So we both thought it would be good for you to come on and tell everybody a little bit about your story and some of your insights into the movements.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here. And I've watched a number of your podcasts, and I find them to be fascinating. There's not a lot of people doing a lot of work analyzing the history of the Latter Rain movement critically, and so I really do appreciate your efforts in that regard. I was born into a Pentecostal family. Both my paternal and maternal grandparents were active in the Apostolic Church initially in Wales, but in the UK in general. My paternal grandfather was an ordained minister in the Apostolic Church. My maternal grandfather was a lay minister in the Apostolic Church in Wales. So I've been associated with Pentecostalism since I was born, basically. Then shortly after I was born, I may have been 1 or 2 years old. My father was ordained in the Apostolic Church, and he became a minister at a church in a suburb of London, England. And he didn't stay in the Apostolic Church very long. That was in 1955, I believe. Which was when the Latter Rain movement had been brought from North America to the UK via a couple of people who my father knew quite well. One was Fred Poole, who was apostolic. I think he was the general superintendent of the Apostolic Church in North America, if my memory serves correctly. And then Cecil Cousin, who was an apostolic minister that had emigrated to Canada probably in the mid-1940s and had run across the Latter Rain movement in Detroit. And they both came to the UK and brought whatever features of the Latter Rain that they thought were relevant, and the Apostolic Church found objectionable for one reason or another. It's not entirely clear to me what it was that the Apostolic Church found objectionable in the Latter Rain, because many of those ideas seem consistent with the apostolic practices from the beginning. But anyway, Cecil Cousin, Fred Poole, who brought it over to England, I think he went back to the U.S. He had a church in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Cecil Cousin moved back to the UK, and the Apostolic Church promptly kicked him out for his association with the Latter Rain. And my father followed suit I don't know if he left of his own free will or if he was kicked out also along with Cecil Cousin. But anyway, he left the Apostolic Church and started an independent Latter Rain church in South Wales when I was quite young. So I was initiated into the movement before I was conscious, really. And so I grew up in South Wales in a Latter Rain Pentecostal church. And then eventually, I could talk some more about this if you want. My father emigrated to the United States, and became a faculty member at Elam Bible Institute in upstate New York, which was a Latter Rain Bible college that had been founded by Ivan Spencer. Right. And Ivan Spencer picked up the Latter Rain in Detroit, and I think that's where he met Cecil Cousin, who turned out to be a very influential figure in the Charismatic movement in the UK in the 60s and 70s, taking Pentecostalism from its, I would say, its working class roots in the UK into the more respectable denominations in the UK, Church of England and other denominations. Cecil Cousin was kind of an unusual figure in the Apostolic Church. He was the first apostolic in the UK to go to university. He had a degree from Cambridge, and I think that was largely because he came from a relatively wealthy family, one of the founders of the Apostolic Church. And so he was probably well suited, having been educated into the British upper class, to take Pentecostalism from its working class roots and spread it around the UK. He had a weekly or monthly magazine. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head. But anyway, before my father emigrated to the United States, he actually teamed up with Cecil Cousin in Yorkshire. They co-pastored a church there. I think Cecil spent his time producing the literature, and my father took care of the business end of a congregation. That magazine, I presume, I remember seeing it all around the house as a kid. I would read it periodically. My memory is very unclear about its contents. I assume it had a lot to do with the healing revivals that were taking place in North America.
Yeah, I would say so. That was about the time when the healing revival went into what they called the worldwide healing revival instead of just the United States. You're mentioning all of these names, and it makes me feel a little bit guilty. I've got approximately 200 now research requests, and Cecil Cousins and Fred Poole are two men that I have in my list. I've just not been able to get to them yet. But what's interesting is you mentioned your thoughts on the apostolic churches who denounced latter rain yet held on to many of the themes. That's something that I too have explored and wondered, well, what in the world was going on? Because the Assemblies of God, for example, were so deeply tied to latter rain, and they were sponsoring it even long after they were denouncing it. They were sponsoring it. And I was really shocked when I learned that the Assemblies of God in the state of Indiana became a rogue state. In other words, they supported latter rain against the will of the General Council, mainly because William Branham was from Indiana, obviously. But you're right, they seem to denounce it, yet hold many of its fundamentals. And the conclusion I have come to is basically that it wasn't so much the doctrine, it's that they felt like they were losing control from the upper management of these things. These organizations could not control where this was headed.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting observation. A couple of things. One is I don't think that the Assemblies of God, either in North America or in the UK, believed that there were apostles that could be ordained in the 20th century. They did not accept the idea that God was choosing apostles. And that was a conflict between the Apostolic Church and the Assemblies of God in the early 20th century in South Wales. And so when the latter rain came along, it's easy for me to see that conflict between the Assemblies of God and the Apostolic Church, because there had long been this argument as to whether or not people could be ordained as apostles and get some kind of pretty significant religious power in the organization as a result of that ordination. But I agree with you. My kind of take on your view that the managerial elite was losing control is that the initial generation of Pentecostal leaders were aging out by the late 1940s. And so you had a new generation of apostolics coming up. Like my father in particular, if you use him as an example, he was drafted into World War II and then became an officer in the British Army. And so he already had a taste of managerial power as an officer in the British Army. So I think you would find someone like that not likely to be the kind of person willing to take orders from the older generation that were aging out. They wanted to have some power themselves. And I assume there were a fair number of Pentecostals who had served in World War II, came back and wanted to maybe be the equals of the first generation of leaders. And those older leaders found undermining their authority, perhaps, is the way I would look at it.
I agree. And there was also the financial aspect, right? There's so much money flowing through this, and a lot of that money, even though it went into some of the offering baskets of the churches, the majority of the money went to these apostles or prophets that the Latter Rain had sent out.
That's a really interesting point, because I can't speak to one key issue, sore point with my father when he was a minister in the Apostolic Church in London. He was a fairly ambitious guy and would preach at more than in his local congregation, right? He might have a revival meeting or something like that. And the way the Apostolic Church divided up the money in the UK, now I don't know all the details on this, and I haven't looked at any records that shows their policy, but I have heard conversations between my mother and father about this issue. All the ministers were paid the same. Now, I don't know if they were paid the same in every church in the United Kingdom, or maybe the regions were different. Perhaps someone got paid more in London than they did in a more remote area. But all the ministers got the same. And if a minister carried out a revival and got some money for preaching at that revival, it did not belong to that minister. That minister had to turn over that money to the denomination. And then that money was split up amongst the ministers in the church. So it was probably a result of, this is, again, a kind of guess on my part, but the Apostolic Church was founded in highly unionized areas in the UK. It was an industrial religion. And so union activity usually produces the same wages for every union member. And so when the church initiated its remuneration policy, they said, roughly, we're going to do the same thing that happens in the mines. And so they wanted to keep some kind of equal pay going out amongst its ministers. And this pissed off my father, right? He thought he was doing the preaching at the revival. He should get to keep the money that he made, because he was working a little harder than the other guy who didn't have a revival meeting that Friday night or whatever it was. So the money component, you're correct. I think that is a very significant issue. And my view on why my father emigrated to the United States as a Pentecostal minister is because he saw great opportunity to make more money in the United States than he could in the UK. Now, this is some people would call it cynical, secular view of my father's motivations. My siblings would disagree, right? They would say God called him to come to North America.
Right.
And surely that's exactly what he said, that God called him to come to North America. But that's what every Pentecostal minister says when they move around. But there's way more interesting and complex motivations than that in the background, I believe.
Yeah, exactly. I've been digging deeply into A.B. Simpson and the Christian Missionary Alliance and their influence on Pentecostalism. As you know, A.B. Simpson never really joined the Pentecostal movement, but many of his ideas showed up in the Pentecostal movement. So I've been tracing that history, trying to find, where did it happen? And the point of transference appears to be Frank Sanford. Sanford influenced Parham and so on and so forth. But they were talking about, in some of the newspaper reports I've read, in today's money, man, it was millions of dollars that he was getting for some of these revivals. People were giving them deeds to their houses, necklaces, jewelry, money like you can't even imagine. And I found one argument in the newspaper between Simpson and the newspaper journalist in which the journalist called him out and said, most of the funding, according to Simpson, most of the funding is handled by our treasurer, so you can't even put this on me. Well, then the journalist responded, well, your wife is the treasurer. And it's all going into her personal bank account. And so once it goes into the personal, how do you separate what's a personal expense and a business expense? And in the end, there's no way to do it, right? So this was the pattern and the style. Now, I'm not saying every Pentecostal minister is motivated by money, but if you look at some of the big names in the revival campaigns, William Branham, the newspaper said that 2 hefty men were required to carry boxes, or suitcases, I think they said, suitcases of money from his meetings.
Yeah, there must have been a lot of money involved, because didn't the IRS go after him and he had to pay a $40,000 fine for avoiding taxes?
$300,000. So if you do the math, if you do the math on the percentage of money, I want to say, I'm taxed at I don't know what it is. It's 20, 30%, right? Well, if you're making that kind of money and you're paying $300,000 in taxes, I can't even imagine how much money you're
yes. So I would like to look at most of the Pentecostal history that I've read does not delve into the financial records. And I think the financial records would shed a lot of light as to what was happening in the background that's not discussed in the open, or wasn't discussed in the open, or at least is not discussed in the open except for people like you and me, right, who would like to know more about the economics of the movement.
Yeah. I remember at my grandfather's church, I was always forthright about the money. I didn't make that much money anyway, so when I paid the check, I handed it to the treasurer directly, and every once in a while, I would not get back a receipt at the end of the year with the same amount of money that I gave in. And I'm talking, it was off by thousands of dollars. And so I'd have to go back and say, well, look, there's a mistake made here. And on the bulletin board, as you walked into my grandfather's church, they had this financial report, which was not much more than a bullet point list saying, you gave us some money and we used it. That's about all it said. And I come to find out that, a lot of the things that were in that list weren't quite kosher. And I didn't realize it until I went to my new church, and I went to one of the business meetings. I can't remember how they called it at the church, but they handed each of us this stack of papers. I want to say it was 1/8 of an inch thick, and said, here are the expenses that we have in the church. And it was all the way down to, we need 7 boxes of rolls of toilet paper. I mean, it was so accountable, right? Versus at my grandfather's church, not a single, you did not know where your money went.
So it's interesting, there's that organization called Evangelicals for Financial Responsibility. I think that's the name of the organization. And you can join it, and then you have to provide some kind of document accounting that you are spending your money appropriately. And I do know Latter Rain organizations that do currently belong to that organization, but I don't know how long that's been around. I doubt if it was around in the mid-1960s or the 50s or the 40s. And I'm sure there are some that don't belong to it again. But the issue of money is actually quite intriguing to me on this issue, partly because of what I knew once we emigrated to the United States. And then we moved to upstate New York, where my father was on the faculty of Elam Bible Institute. And that had a really interesting economic system on that campus, which counters in many ways what we both think about how much money was coming into the Latter Rain movement in the healing revivals. Everybody who worked on that campus, now I'll have to make some exceptions to this, right? But everyone that worked on the campus got paid the same amount, whether it was the president or the janitor. No one made more than anyone else. Everyone lived in housing provided by the Institute, and everyone ate meals in common. So it was a communist organization, even though when I say that to the people who lived there, and I know they all just recoil in horror because they were all anti-communists while living in a communist organization. Now, there were some distinctions, like women got paid less than men. There weren't very many women working there. There were some, what you would have called secretaries. Nowadays, it would be administrative assistants, receptionists, things like that. They were paid less than men, and married men were paid more than single men. And most married women, I think I would say all married women there, did not work. So it was in many ways an egalitarian economic system, even though the authority was hierarchical. It was really run by a small cadre of powerful males. But money-wise, at least on paper, now there were some, and this is relevant to our discussion about how do Pentecostals make money and how much do they make. My father was there initially. He was a faculty member. Then he became the academic dean. Then he became the vice president. And eventually he became president of the college. My wife, who was also lived on that campus, her father was a mason. And so he did the construction masonry, concrete work, brickwork, all those kind of things. And the place was expanding in the 1960s and 70s. And my mother-in-law had a great deal of resentment over the fact that the powerful ministers who ran the institution could go out and preach on a weekend and bring back substantial sums of money, whereas the staff who were working class blue collar people, if they went out and took a job on a Saturday, they would make a fraction of what the ministers made. And this was sometimes reflected in the cars that the various classes of people drove on campus. So even though it was the actual salaries that were paid out every month were equal, the side jobs were vastly different in their ability to enrich the ministerial class as opposed to the working class of that institution.
There's another aspect too, and my family's probably going to think I dislike my grandfather, which isn't true, but he is my example, right? Because I was there, I saw it all. There's also the issue of how the money comes in. My grandfather was very forthcoming with his church about how much he was paid, the money, where the money went, etc. he got a salary from the church, and it was a meager salary. It wasn't that much. And then the bulk of the money that was donated in, he would collect the tithes and offering twice. There were 2 services. So every Sunday morning, there's 2 sets of baskets that went, and people contributed in both, which was odd. But he would tell the people, I get X number of dollars, and the rest of it goes, quote, to the organization, which means the Branham organization, right? And that was supposed to be for missionary work. Legally, I'm not going to talk about that right now, but there were some things going on. I'll just say it like that. But what was odd about it is my grandfather would preach these we listened to recordings of William Branham from 1947 to 1965. Before the tape was played, Grandpa would preach this miniature sermonette about the tape. And sometimes he would talk about the money and talk about tithing and stress the importance of tithing, but he would make these random statements like the tithes should go to the pastor. And everybody's putting the money in the plates, right? Well, I've been to his house when large sums of money were given to the pastor, and that was outside of the salary, off of the record books. And Grandpa had wads of cash like you would not believe. And when I looked at the courthouse has the records of his estate. When I saw how much was there, my mind was blown. Like, even seeing the amount of cash that flowed into my grandfather's hands, had no idea it could accumulate to that level. So there was a lot of money. But all this to say, there are many ministers in Pentecostalism who are paid a meager salary, but there's this fine line between, they say, tithes and offering. There's this fine line between where does your tithing go and where does the offering go?
Yes. I've got one observation on this topic, which shocked me at the time, and it's related to other issues. But I graduated from that Bible college where we lived. When I got out of high school, I spent 3 years at that Bible college on a ministerial track. And so in the final semester of your senior year, if you were on a ministerial track, you had to go intern with a minister somewhere for a week. And you left the college campus, went and lived with the minister, and learned what a week in the life of a Pentecostal minister was. Now, you may correct me, you may know more about the Latter Rain than I do, but for the most part, the Latter Rain was a white Pentecostal movement. It didn't extend very deeply into black Pentecostalism, probably for a lot of different reasons. But anyway, during that, there was, and the Elam Bible Institute, where I went to, where my family lived and where I went to Bible college, it was clearly a white institution. In all the years I lived there, there's a handful of North American non-whites who ever showed up on campus. But one of those people was a black Pentecostal minister from Rochester, New York, whose grandfather founded a black Pentecostal denomination called the Church of God in True Holiness. And somehow he got connected up to the Bible Institute. And he was fairly close friends with my father. And so I don't know how I ended up being assigned to him when I had to do my week's internship, but I went, his name was Paul Garlington. He's dead now. So I went and spent a week with him. And what totally shocked me, so this would have been the spring of 1974. The way his congregation paid him was they gave him a credit card and they told him, use this credit card for whatever you want. And so he just had unlimited access to that credit card. And I'd never heard of such a thing. I didn't own a credit card at the time. Credit cards were not as widespread as they are nowadays. And it really set me back. But it's probably a difference between black and white Pentecostals, right? The black Pentecostal ministers usually drove a fairly nice Cadillac or a Lincoln or something like that. And so black Pentecostal denominations wanted to show off their pastor and show off his wealth. And he eventually ended up getting into trouble with the IRS. I presume over the use of that credit card, because the IRS probably wouldn't look kindly on, well, this is the distinction between personal and church expenses. They're all listed on this credit card.
Much like A.B. Simpson's wife, right?
Yeah.
Have you ever wondered how the Pentecostal movement started, or how the progression of modern Pentecostalism transitioned through the Latter Rain, Charismatic, and other fringe movements into the New Apostolic Reformation? You can learn this and more on William Branham Historical Research's website, william-branham.org. On the books page of the website, you can find the compiled research of John Collins, Charles Paisley, Stephen Montgomery, John McKinnon, and others, with links to the paper, audio, and digital versions of each book. You can also find resources and documentation on various people and topics related to those movements. If you want to contribute to the cause, you can support the podcast by clicking the Contribute button at the top. And as always, be sure to like and subscribe to the audio or video version that you're listening to or watching. On behalf of William Branham Historical Research, we want to thank you for your support. I've been studying, exactly that. The Latter Rain movement did have people of color, but there weren't many. And, if you look at the leadership in this, obviously, William Branham had the ties to white supremacy, but beyond that, I'm finding Gordon Lindsay speaking at Christian identity conferences, and you have leaders out of the Sharon Orphanage and who had ties to Elam who were preaching the racist versions of Christian identity, the more extreme, I should say, racist versions. So I have to conclude that there were probably African American people who were curious and wanted to get in it, but the moment they heard somebody mention the word mongrel, which was a common theme among the Christian identity people, I'm certain that they would have just left and said, no, this is not a good place.
Yeah, so it seems to me, and this may be far too broad a generalization, but my guess is that in the 1940s and 50s, most white Pentecostals were racists. Now, I say that partly because of two things that I know. One is that, I don't know if you're aware of this or not, that the Assemblies of God refused to ordain black men.
Yes.
In the United States. They were ordaining them in Africa, but they wouldn't ordain black men in the United States. And there was a big hullabaloo in the Apostolic Church in the UK when the Apostolic Church decided to ordain black apostles. And they had to do that because they had huge churches in Africa, Nigeria, Ghana, and so they needed leadership in those places, and so they needed to ordain black apostles. But when they did that, they had a clause that said if we ordain a black apostle, that apostle could have authority over black people, but not over white people. Whereas white apostles could have authority over both white people and black people. So that was in the early 50s. So I think the racism was probably fairly widespread. I did know fairly well Winston Nunes, who was connected with the Latter Rain movement. He was from Toronto, and he was from Trinidad. I'm not sure if you'd say he was black, maybe of mixed race, definitely not white. But he was the only active participant in the Latter Rain that I knew of that was not obviously white. So that whole history of the connection between white and black Pentecostalism intrigues me because it started out as a fairly egalitarian movement in California. There were blacks and whites together. in California in the early 20th century at Azusa Street. But as soon as the movement moved back to the South, and the Assemblies of God and the Church of God in Christ started their denominations I think that was in the late teens of the, so 1918, 1920, somewhere in that area. They were segregated denominations. There were no black leaders at the founding of the Assemblies of God, and they just all went with the Church of God. The black denomination was the Church of God in Christ.
And you had people like Parham, who, I won't use the words that he used, but he frowned heavily upon the people with black skin mingling, I think he said, with the people with white skin, and used some very derogatory terms in his assessment of Azusa Street. But you're right, when it came back, you had people like F.F. Bosworth, who was Branham's mentor in the doctrinal teachings of Dowie. And he was from, he had churches throughout Texas. And, I trying to trace his history with mixed race churches. And it's really interesting because you find a lot of statements claiming that Bosworth was very pro-interracial churches, but yet he's speaking at places like the Ku Klux Klan headquarters, Cadle Tabernacle in Indianapolis. And a man who is for racial integration and equality doesn't go to the Klan headquarters and hold several revivals.
And, the South, I think every state in the South had laws forbidding interracial marriage up until 1967, when the Supreme Court overruled those laws. So one would expect then that most of those Pentecostals in the South had some affinity for those laws, right? They thought that, and I know at the Bible College, where Elam Bible Institute, there were people there in the late 1960s absolutely adamantly opposed to interracial marriage. And there were, on occasion, a few black African Americans who showed up on campus. And I'm familiar with one case in which a white woman was dating the only black man on campus, and the administration took efforts to make sure that they were stopped. So yes, racism, I think, runs throughout the mid-20th century. Latter Rain. Like I did know some of those people from the Sharon Orphanage. Like when I moved to that Bible college was in Lima, New York, Milford Kirkpatrick lived there. And he was from the Sharon Orphanage. He was there when the Latter Rain revival broke out in the late 1940s, and he lived on the campus for probably 3 or 4 years. Probably he wasn't a staff member or a faculty member of the college. I think he lived there as kind of a base, and he traveled as an evangelist. But he lived there, I think, because he had a couple of kids who needed to go to high school, and they needed some place to, have their high school. And so at least his son was at the high school there. I don't know. I was not aware of his racial ideas. It wouldn't surprise me if he had white supremacist ideas, but I was not personally aware of those.
And the way the Christian identity movement embedded itself in Latter Rain, to the people who were indoctrinated with it, they would not have considered them to be racist ideas.
No, that's true. That's right.
I was taught that interracial marriage was of the devil and that the offspring could not make it into the kingdom of heaven, all of this, very, very racist things. But I would have considered myself a defender and fighter for racial equality while I was in it thinking of this, right?
Yeah. So it's a complicated matter, right, to try to sort out the extent. Like if the majority of your society is racist, then trying to label some individual as particularly racist is difficult, right? Because they're just reflecting what the general attitude is in the society around them.
And it just shows the success of people like Branham's mentor, Roy E. Davis, who is trying to sway American politics through religion. It was a political cult, make pure, plain and simple. It was a political cult. But they're trying to influence religion to match the white supremacy's racism as a quote-unquote Christian organization, because that's how the Klan and all these white supremacy organizations touted themselves, as being pure American or true American and Christian. So when they spread these ideas into religion, they swayed the religion and the politics.
So that's a really interesting topic, the extent to which Pentecostalism was or is a political religion. I think it clearly is a political religion today.
Absolutely.
So when Pentecostalism began, I would say it was an apolitical religion, that it was a pacifist movement. And so lots of Pentecostals, maybe even the majority of Pentecostals, males at least, refused to fight in World War I. And lots of them were imprisoned. Lots of them were killed for not being patriotic enough. And it was a surprise to me maybe 10 or 15 years ago when I learned that the largest pacifist denomination in the United States up until the mid-1960s was the Assemblies of God. They were officially pacifist until 1967. And one of the leaders of that pacifism, I shouldn't say that. Certainly, Stanley Frodsham, who was the editor of I think it was called the Pentecostal Evangel, which was the Assemblies of God monthly magazine. He was an ardent pacifist, and he joined the Latter Rain movement, and I think he got kicked out of the Assemblies of God. And I knew him. He used to visit. In fact, he lived on campus for a while when I was in my teenage years. And so he was a prominent Pentecostal pacifist. So the reason I bring that up is its relationship in general to politics. That pacifism is not really just a view about whether or not you should fight in a war. It's a view about state violence and state coercion. And most early Pentecostals drew a sharp line of distinction between the kingdom of this world and the kingdom of God. And the kingdom of this world was the state, and it used coercive force in, regular day-to-day life, and it used more coercive force during war. So early Pentecostalism really didn't want to have much engagement with politics because it implied that you were giving yourself to the kingdom of this world. So that transition to a political religion really intrigues me. And until you spoke a few minutes ago, it hadn't really struck me that perhaps that's connected with white supremacy and the rise of the civil rights movement and it's not just white supremacy, it's white male supremacy. So it's connected as a response to the civil rights movement and the women's rights movement, which threaten those ideas. So
more specifically, it's tied to the Christian identity movement, which is the subject for the book that I'm actually working on right now, the manuscript.
Okay, all right.
You're right. The early Pentecostals were not at all political. In fact, they would, like you said, the kingdom is not of this world. This is not my home. And they even sang these songs. The world is not my home. Yes. I'm just passing through.
Right.
If you line up the Pentecostal / Latter Rain timeline with the Christian identity timeline, recognizing that many of these men were cross-pollinating, such as Davis, such as William D. Upshaw, such as, several other names. Gerald Winrod, who was one of the fathers of Christian identity. As soon as William Jennings Bryan spread his politics throughout the South, Christian fundamentalism, the notion that the church was being invaded by Catholicism, spreading evolution, there were many Pentecostals that this resonated with. And there came a point in time, and I'm still researching to know exactly the point of the shift, but Christian identity rose up against Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and that led to the Great Sedition trial, many of the things we covered in our historical podcast. Well, by that point in time, there were many Christian fundamentalist religions, Pentecostalism included, especially in the South, who were aligned with this theme and felt like the politics of America had been invaded. Well, they created what was called this Jewish plot, that the Jews had invaded Washington, that Franklin Delano Roosevelt was communist, working with the commies. All of this shifted, and you even watched the white supremacy parties shift at that point in time. They all were unanimously against FDR.
Yeah, so I'm largely ignorant of the Christian identity movement, so I can't engage in much conversation about that topic because it's not something I'm aware of it, but it's not something I've read a lot about or was personally familiar with. But I can certainly see where that would have happened. And certainly the Pentecostals that I grew up with were anti-communist. So it's kind of odd. So they had this globalness, like Russia was Gog or Magog or something that. They were being up. So they saw other countries as political agents about which they should have an opinion, but they weren't actively involved in local politics, state politics, national politics in the United States. It was very rare that growing up in the Latter Rain, I heard any conversations about political campaigns. Their attention, and it's really because when they live in a world, I'd say the Latter Rain people, maybe Pentecostals in general, live in a fantasy world. That in the real world, the centers of power are London, New York, Washington, D.C., Moscow, Beijing. Pentecostals think that God has a different power structure, and those power centers are what? Jeffersonville, Indiana, Springfield, Missouri, Lima, New York, and these are the places where God is moving, and the agents of that power are them. It's the apostles of the Latter Rain who are the equivalent of presidents, ambassadors, and so they had like this multinational theocratic imagination in which everyday politics of a given country was largely irrelevant to the grand scheme of what was happening in the universe. So they weren't. The fact that today there are Pentecostal prophets prophesying, particularly Latter Rain people, I probably on a weekly basis about Donald Trump is just mind-boggling in terms of the transition that's occurred since, I would say, 1965 until now, that it has now become an almost completely national political religion.
Well, and that is the exact subject of my next book, how Christian identity transformed through the Latter Rain and many of these various other movements into what's called the New Apostolic Reformation, where they had a 7-mountain mandate. In other words, seven categories that they would take dominion over, politics being one of them. And what struck me funny, I listened to this NPR program, and this lady was talking about the 7-mountain mandate, and she said the most important mandate of the 7 mountains is the finances, because without it, the whole rest of it falls apart.
Well, that's probably true. Yeah, so that transition intrigues me. And I think it's probably a reflection in many ways of the movement from Pentecostalism as a working class religion. And the working class typically does not have a lot of political power into the business classes and the managerial classes of the United States. One book about the history of Pentecostalism I found to be really very, very insightful is Robert Mapes Anderson's, I think it's called Vision of the Disinherited. And he looks at the growth of Pentecostalism in the United States. It was his doctoral dissertation, probably in the early 60s, maybe. One of the first sociologists, maybe the first sociologist, to take a close look at Pentecostalism in the United States. And he argues that it was a religion of the dispossessed, the alienated, the poor. And I think he was largely correct, right? But I love that book, and I think it provides a lot of insight as to why the religion worked. Because the people in those social classes feel powerless. They don't feel capable of manipulating the political system. They're at the bottom end. Whereas if you think you're an agent of God, and all of a sudden now you're an apostle that's having some influence on the universe, this gives you an immense sense of self-worth that's not available in the political system.
You're empowered.
But yes, empowered. And I think that's really important to a person, and explains a lot to me why people find the movement attractive. But what Anderson did not analyze, and I'm guessing it's because he simply was unaware of it in the 1960s, was the movement of something like the Full Gospel Businessmen's Association International in Pentecostalism, which was a deliberate attempt to, in North America initially, in the United States initially, to take Pentecostalism from the working classes and deliver it directly to the business owners and the managerial class in the United States. Now, that's a different game altogether than what Pentecostalism was in its beginnings. When you look at that, you can understand why business people are far more active in the political system. They have they have got more money to spend to aid their political candidates. They have a larger voice in the system. And so once Pentecostalism starts building its influence in the managerial classes, then I think it immediately suggests that it's going to become a much more political religion. But the other thing that happened, and I think this is directly related to the Latter Rain movement, is there were lots of Pentecostal ministers who got kicked out of their denominations as a result of embracing the Latter Rain. And so they immediately had no market for their services, right? The Assemblies of God would not let them preach in their churches. The Apostolic Church in the UK would not let them preach in their churches. So they had to sell their wares elsewhere. And so they turned to traditional Protestant, mainline Protestant denominations where they thought they could introduce Pentecostalism. And my father spent much of his career preaching, teaching to non-Pentecostals, Catholics, Episcopalians, who else? Presbyterians. And so those denominations were denominations not of the working class predominantly, but for the middle class or the upper class in the United States. So the Latter Rain, by excluding a large set of ministers from ministering to the working classes, pushed them to minister to the middle, and upper classes in the United States. And so, for instance, I would argue that I was just listening to this before we got together this morning. I was listening to the Supreme Court hearing about it was about whether the law applied to January 6 rioters, and Amy Coney Barrett was questioning the lawyers in that case, and I would say that she is the first latter rain Supreme Court justice, because she was raised in the People of Praise commune. Now, the People of Praise commune is a Catholic charismatic commune that began in the 1970s as a result of the interaction between latter rain ministers and Catholic, mostly lay people, some priests, and those Catholic charismatic communes are a direct result of those latter rain ministers looking for other places to introduce Pentecostalism. And so maybe you could say that John Ashworth was the first Pentecostal attorney general in the United States, but the first latter rain national legal figure, I would say, is probably Amy Coney Barrett, who still belongs to that community of praise. So you can see there the movement into the upper echelons of American, maybe not the upper echelons, but certainly the everyday echelons of American politics as a result of the latter rain movement.
Yeah, I think you're right. A lot of people are unfamiliar with the fact that the latter rain and Catholicism in some cases merged, because the latter rain touted itself as an interdenominational faith. And I know that's counterproductive to when you think Christian identity. They were against Catholicism. But remember, the mission was to convert the Catholics. So if they can assimilate the Catholics, then mission accomplished, right? So
yeah, exactly.
It's just so crazy interesting. And, to your point earlier, you're talking about the difference in what Pentecostalism started and how it began. I think people know I examine all of the critical information about Pentecostalism, and I get accused often of being a Pentecostal hater. But in the end, what they had initially, even though some of it had some history that, in my opinion, was just smoke and mirrors, the initial theme wasn't that bad. If they would have allowed for accountability and, well, basically what the Bible says, iron sharpening iron. You learn from people, you grow, you learn more, you grow. But iron and smoke and mirrors can't sharpen each other. And so you end up with this weird mess, right? So I delve into the mess, and where people stand, that's up to them. But this has been incredibly fun, and I feel like we've just skimmed the surface. We haven't really gone that deep. So would you like to come back again and talk?
Certainly I'll come back. I enjoyed the conversation, and I hope someone else might find it interesting or useful somewhere.
Absolutely. I'm certain they will. So if you've enjoyed our show and you want more information, you can check us out on the web. You can find us at william-branham.org. For an overview of the historical research of William Branham and the Healing Revivals, read Preacher Behind the White Hoods, a critical examination of William Branham and his message, available on Amazon, Kindle, and Audible.